Hey everyone, welcome back to Lust is Boring. Last week we had a tremendous episode with an endocrinologist who helped us to understand from a scientific perspective the science behind gender. And so we've had other episodes where we dove into the spirituality of it, the theology of it, but today we want to take a look at the psychology of gender. Is gender just a social construct, as some people say? What are the differences between men and women beyond simply the reproductive functions and the anatomical features and structures? Is there such a thing as a male-female brain? Are things like rapid onset gender dysphoria a real thing? If parents have a kid who comes out as trans, what should the parents do in a way that's going to objectively be best for that kid? Because a lot of people are told, well, if you don't just go along with the kid, they're going to commit suicide. And then other parents think, okay, well, then we just got to go full steam ahead, or otherwise we're increasing that kid's risks of depression and isolation. And what do we do? How do we effectively communicate? And so today we've got a wonderful opportunity to talk with a psychologist with a background in understanding these things. Before we dive in, first I want to thank some of our sponsors, namely Hallow. Advent is not over, and so don't miss the opportunity to check out the challenge that Hallow is doing. It's basically a hashtag Pray25. It's a challenge for 25 days of Advent. It doesn't matter if you missed the first couple of weeks. Hop right in. Advent is a fantastic time that a lot of times we miss the opportunity to draw near to Christ because we get wrapped up. And do I got everyone's presents? Is all this all set up? If you're in college, you've got to worry about finals. Slow down. Get this app. It's free. You can just go to hallow.com/lustisboring. Download this thing. Maybe when you're going to bed, you wake up in the morning, just click the challenge of the day, listen to it. You can set, I want the 5-minute or like 6-minute version, the 10-minute version. You can pick your version. Like today's meditation focused on a quote from St. John Paul II that we could ruminate over during Advent. And sometimes not maybe easy to know what to focus on in your prayer time in preparation for Christ's coming. The Hallow app makes it a heck of a lot easier. So download that. And then also big shout out to our supporters on Patreon. Thank you for making this program possible. Not only do you support the program by supporting us on Patreon, you support Kristalina and I and our family and our 8 crazy kids. And so it's just a real blessing. If our ministry has been a blessing to you, it's a way to bless us back and just help us to grow this ministry and the mission and support our family. Just go to patreon.com/Jason Evert. You can support us for $5 a month, 10 or whatever, and then you can message us through that. You got questions for the show you want us to ask, you can send us those in. All that is available on Patreon. And so back to today's program. We have a psychologist with us, Dr. Andrew Sodergren. He's a Catholic psychologist and the director of psychological services for Ruah Woods, which is a theology of the body ministry in Cincinnati. He earned his master's degree in clinical psychology from Divine Mercy University's Institute for the Psychological Sciences. He also holds a master's degree in theology from the Pontifical John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and the Family at the Catholic U, where he annually teaches a course as an adjunct professor. He and his wife Ellie have been married, best of all, 22 years and have 5 children. And so, Doctor, I want to welcome you to the show. Thank you for joining us on Lust is Boring.
Thank you, Jason. I'm happy to be with you today.
Tell us, if you will, a little bit about Ruah Woods. I've been familiar for their fantastic work for a long time, but for the sake of the listeners, tell us what their mission is and what it is they're doing for the church.
Absolutely. So Ruah Woods is a theology of the body ministry based here in Cincinnati that helps men and women answer the vocation to love, the calling to total self-giving love. And we do that through 2 main forms of outreach. One is educational, teaching people theology of the body, especially empowering Catholic educators to bring theology of the body into their classrooms, to bring it to their students, whether that's in a Catholic school setting or in a parish religious education setting or in a homeschool setting, and also through faith-informed psychological services. So you mentioned I'm the director of psych services. I have a team of mental health professionals with me here in Cincinnati where we see a wide range of people, and we try to help them grow in their capacity to give and receive love and to heal from their wounds, to be able to say yes to love more fully. And we do that from a Catholic view of the human person.
Yeah. Do you do it virtually, remotely, for anybody who might take advantage of those services of healing but might not live in Cincinnati?
That's a great question, Jason. And Personally, being a theology of the body ministry, I feel it's best to be embodied in person with the patient.
Yeah.
And so for psych services, we are primarily a Cincinnati area, this region. Our educational side with the theology of the body curriculum that we've developed and the formation opportunities that we've developed, that has no borders. So we're reaching out further and further on the educational side, but psych services, we're still based here locally.
Okay, got it. And so if you guys want to check it out, Ruah is Ruah Woods. So go to their website, Google them. Lots of awesome theology of the body stuff there. Now, theology of the body obviously focuses a great deal of its content on sexual difference. I almost feel like that is like the key topic of our age right now, sexual difference. Is there such a thing as sexual difference? Is gender just a social construct? And so I'd pose you that question to kind of start things off. Is gender kind of just a social construct, or is there really an objective meaning and ultimate purpose of our sexual difference as male and female?
Right. It's great. It's a great and very rich question. So the distinction that's often made between sex and gender, first of all, it's helpful to just realize that's a very recent phenomenon, that it's only been really within the last 100 years or less that we've tended to think of these as somehow separate things. That sex and gender are distinct aspects of the person. Historically, we've always thought of them as one and the same, that our bodies are sexed as a species. We are male or female, and that says something fundamental about who we are. And it's this very recent idea that somehow gender, or gender identity as it's often named, refers to something different, something internal and subjective about the person that may or may not correspond with what's manifest in the body. And this is a somewhat problematic view. There's obviously, you can make this distinction. I think it's a distinction between what's in the subjective realm and what's in the objective realm. In other words, subjective is my internal thoughts and feelings about things. Objective is what's real and factual, what's based in reality. And traditionally, one of the hallmarks of mental health is when things in the subjective realm more or less correspond to what's in the objective realm, right? If my thoughts and my beliefs are differ wildly from what's objective, real, factual, then I'm not living in reality. And in my profession, one of the traditional terms that we use for really persistent beliefs that defy reality are delusions, and it's a hallmark of mental illness. So, getting back to your question, is gender a social construct? Well, if by gender we're talking about male and female, absolutely not. These are objective facts that are the part of the reality of what it means to be human. In fact, it's part of the reality of what it means to be a mammal, more broadly, right? All these different species are sexed species, and human beings are, in a sense, part of that. We of course, as I'm sure you talk about many times, Jason, and others as well, that human beings are unique and that we have sort of one foot in the realm of animals and one foot in the spiritual realm as well. So in our bodies, we sort of take up so much of what we see in the rest of creation, and in a certain way, there are similarities, but our bodies reflect a spiritual reality of personhood. And so male and female are real and factual aspect of what it means to be human, but they take on a greater importance and a higher meaning for us as human beings. Now, sometimes when we talk about gender, we're talking, what people have in mind are stereotypes, right? That men are this way, they're tough and rugged and they do these kinds of things and not these kinds of things. And women are soft and gentle and they do these things and not these kinds of things, right? And this kind of stereotypical thinking can run us into trouble. And when we as Catholics talk about male and female and the importance of male and female, it's important for people to understand that we're not talking about stereotypes. we're not talking in the first instance about these kinds of social roles or surface level traits. We're talking about a deeper reality of um, a certain kind of person and our aptitude to be able to come together to form a communion of persons. And so sex is a reality. Gender is a squishier sort of thing. It's more subjective and more cultural. And these things should correspond to each other, right? They should line up. And when they don't line up, there's something that's kind of going awry there, something that we need to understand and if possible, try to work with. Um, but that doesn't mean that the objective reality is somehow not real or something we can dismiss.
Yeah, now I know you've probably seen, I've seen that they've used in elementary schools the genderbread man, and then that later became the gender unicorn. And this is kind of like an icon of the transgender ideology. And it kind of
Right.
points to different parts of the anatomy and says, like, hey, there might be, intellectual attractions, there might be emotional attractions, kind of points to the heart. And then it points to the genitals and says, well, that's where sex is located, that you're either male or female in your genitals. And it kind of compartmentalizes our sexuality and reduces it to the private parts, basically,
That's right.
which leads people to think, okay, well, then I can just remove that or add that, and then I become that gender. The body reveals the person. How else does the human body reveal masculinity and femininity? I'm thinking particularly in terms of the brain.
Yes.
You sometimes hear a male brain, female brain. Is there a difference? Is there, objectively a male brain, female, or is that oversimplifying it? From a clinical perspective, does the brain itself reveal masculinity and femininity, and how so?
Yeah, this is a great question. There are a couple used a key word in there, and that is reduces, right? So this idea of sex is just something that is located in our genitals is a reduction, right? So we see in the body, because the body is sacramental, we see signs in the body of this mysterious reality that we call person. So the body, as you said, reveals the person. And when we see signs in the body of maleness or femaleness, that's telling us something fundamental about who this person is. And yes, those signs are manifest in many aspects of the body beyond just the genitals. Now, the genitals are the most obvious marker, right? And in a certain way, there is a sort of primacy there because um, they show us the capacity for fatherhood or motherhood, which is essential to what it means to be male or female. But there are many signs of our maleness or our femaleness in the body, and including in the brain. We're coming to understand more and more how subtle yet pervasive the process of sexual differentiation is. So sexual differentiation begins at conception, of course, with the coming together of the chromosomes in the new life. And these sex chromosomes, whether we have an XX pair or an XY pair, has manifold effects on the developing child. And the traditional view is that these effects primarily work through hormones. So if you have an XX, then the developing gonads become ovaries. If you have an XY, the developing gonads become testes, and they produce different sex hormones, which then aid to the sexual differentiation of the rest of the body. That's true, but there's actually some recent research showing that the presence of the XX or XY chromosomes themselves, even independent of the working of hormones, affects the way certain cells and tissues behave, including cells in the brain. I first came across this from a researcher in this area who wrote a wonderful chapter in an Oxford handbook on sex differences, outlining this research, and it's is breathtaking. And it's only grown since then. We see more and more how the presence of XX or XY can affect gene expression, for instance, whether certain genes are activated or not. It can depend on whether the cells carry an XX or XY chromosome. And we begin to see more and more how this subtly affects human development from the earliest stages. A couple of years ago, I came across the first study I know of this kind that actually looked at um, brain development. It was a brain scan study of children still in the womb. They looked at the functioning of the brain in children in the third trimester and found that they could detect differences in the way that the brain was developing for the male children versus the female children, especially in what they call functional systems or functional connectivity. In other words, the kinds of neural networks that were being set up in these brains. One thing I want to throw out there as well is that girls' brains from an early age tend to develop more quickly than boys' brains. And anybody who's been a parent or an educator of young children, can testify that girls often do a little bit better, have a little bit better capacity for impulse control and concentration and things like this. And that is a function of their neurological development. They're actually, you could argue, a 6-year-old girl and a 6-year-old boy is really more like comparing a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old. Right? There's this developmental lag with boys. And anyway, going back to this brain scan study for the children in the womb, they found that girls' brains were being developed in a way that supported linking distant parts of the brain together into functional networks where essentially you can combine or interconnect thinking and feeling and different types of complex processes. And the boys' brains were not being organized in the same way. The only aspect of the boys' brain that you saw stronger connectivity than in the girls' brains was in the cerebellum, which is in the back of the skull. It's a part of the brain that's believed to be involved in coordinating motor activity, right? So that was the one way in which you could say the boys were ahead of the girls is the cerebellum, which has to do with motor activity. But in terms of more complex integrative capacities in the brain, these girls already in the womb had a developmental advantage over the boys. So I think we have to be a little bit cautious about not over-interpreting findings like this. There is a large body of research, by the way, on sex differences in adult brains, and I can share a little bit about that as well. But we don't want to over-interpret this and say that there's such a thing as a male brain and a female brain, as if they're sort of two like wholly different categories. There's a huge amount of overlap, right? And these are subtle differences. But it's a beautiful example of how our bodies bear witness to this deeper reality of our maleness and femaleness. In a sense, it's a reality that permeates the whole, and we see these subtle signs everywhere we look.
Yeah.
Right? In some areas, we see it more obviously than others, like in the genitals, also like in the skeleton, in the musculature. Right? An adult man and an adult woman, we often overlook this, are vastly different in terms of physical stature, right? We often act like that doesn't matter, right? That we can just sort of abstract from that, right? We're more alike than we are different, really, and sort of everything's equal. But numbers that I have from the CDC show that the average U.S. man is about 5'9", weighs about 200 pounds. The average U.S. woman is 5'3.5", weighs about 170 pounds. So this is an enormous difference in terms of size and mass, and the weight difference is primarily one of muscle mass. Mm-hmm. And there's a vast literature as well looking at physical capabilities like measures of strength, speed, stamina, different types of physical skills like that, like throwing things or doing different types of physical exercises. And hands down, men are superior on all of these, usually by a very wide margin. Now, we have to remember, of course, that there's always going to be an overlap, right? You're going to have some guys who aren't as good and some women who are, unusually strong and capable in some of these areas. But we're talking about in general, on average, there are enormous differences in our bodies. And these differences are meaningful. They're not meaningless, right? They tell us something if we have the eyes to see and the ears to hear. And they do speak to how the sexes perhaps are called to relate to each other and the kinds of responsibilities that we have for one another. Because we are designed, even in the microarchitecture of our brains and in the more obvious architecture of our bones and our muscles and so forth, for different vocations. Right? A male is called through spousal love towards fatherhood, and a female is called through spousal love toward motherhood. And so our bodies and our souls are oriented in that way and have a special aptitude. And all these different things in the brain and elsewhere, what we're looking at or what we're seeing are signs of that. It's like these anticipatory signs. It's an expression from John Paul II, right? Anticipatory signs of who we are and what we are called to.
Yeah.
So I can go on and on about this, but
I was reading a manuscript of a book that's forthcoming soon that you were a contributing author to called Sexual Identity. And I was enjoying in your chapter where you kind of dive into sexual differences in terms of male, female, like our hearing is different, our vision is different, our sense of smell is different, our capacity to detect emotion is different. And it was really neat to read some of these things, like that, how women's hearing is so far superb and superior compared to male hearing. The only case really in which male hearing is better is in terms of spatial listening, meaning I could hear a crunch of the leaves over there and I could detect where that sound's coming from.
That's right.
That could benefit, a guy if he's hunting or fighting, he could detect that and judge the space. Whereas on basically every other measure, women annihilated men in terms of their hearing capacity, but not just the hearing, the smell, the sight. Could you maybe dive into some of that? Absolutely. Of these sexual differences as it relates to those things?
Yeah, this stuff is really fascinating, and I'm grateful you brought that up. So, and a lot of people are not aware of this, and I wasn't that aware of it until I really dove into this literature in preparation for that book. And so, our senses are what connect us to the world around us, right? It's through our senses that we are aware of our location in space and what's going on around us, and keeps us grounded in reality. And it's interesting to think about how do our maleness and our femaleness subtly affect the way that we perceive the world. And that's what this research is showing us. So in the area of smell, which we call olfaction, women basically are superior across the board. And again, this is a fairly large body of research. I looked at one review study that involved more than 8,000 people. And every measure of smell, such as smell sensitivity, discriminating between smells, identifying specific smells, females performed better than males across a large number of people. And these differences weren't always large in terms of magnitude, but they were consistent. Like there's this consistent female advantage. And you kind of already touched on this. It begs sort of interesting questions of like what's adaptive about that? Like, what is that for? What does that tell us about? And it makes sense from a certain point of view that, women historically, and it makes sense because of again, the way their bodies are designed, that they're often the first food source for children, obviously through breastfeeding, but that usually continues. And it's important for a woman, if she's going to be in a position of feeding others, to be able to detect whether a food is rancid or poisoned or something like this, right? Or adequately cooked or not, right? So this is a little speculative, right? I'm sort of speculating about what the possible advantage of that difference is, but it's there. And you mentioned hearing as well. So hearing, what we see is that even newborn girls produce larger and more frequent what are called otoacoustic emissions. It's a faint clicking sound actually produced by the inner ear, and it corresponds somewhat to hearing acuity. It has to do with how the cochlea works. And there's a sex difference in regards to that. And research on girls and on women do show that women tend to have somewhat more sensitive hearing, but especially in the range of sound that most human speech falls into. It's as if they're slightly better and more ready to pick up on human communication and be able to recognize it and decipher it. Males, on the other hand, like you said, we're better at being able to use sound to locate things, and we have a better tolerance also for loud sounds. That's one of the other areas that we're different with hearing. Is that males can tolerate loud noise typically better than females do, which is also interesting. And the last is vision. So Leonard Sachs has a lot to say about this actually in his book Why Gender Matters. He's written 2 editions to that book now, and it's an interesting book. I mean, you have to sift some aspects of it, but there's a lot of really interesting material in there. And that's where I first came across this, and then I kind of dug into the scientific literature with this a little bit more. And our visual systems are affected by our sexuality, such that we see the world in slightly different ways. Particularly, the way that we perceive color seems to be slightly different. Some would argue that females can perceive color and texture a bit better. Leonard Sachs makes that argument. I think the scientific literature is maybe a little bit more mixed on that. It certainly suggests the idea that we at least perceive color differently, which in my own experience, I know that's the case. At least it is for me and my wife. I mean, she has all these names for different colors. I don't even know what they are.
Fuchsia.
Yeah, I have no idea. It's brown or it's blue, and like just stick to the primary, please.
Yeah.
I don't get it. So we perceive color differently, but also again this whole issue of location and motion. So over a fairly large body of research, males tend to outperform females in visual tests that involve location and motion. Which is very interesting, and that seems to, in some way, lend itself to some of the physical attributes I was talking about earlier, because there's a number of tests showing that men are not only better at throwing distance, but also throwing accuracy. And so the ability to see things in motion and be able to react to things in motion, and to be able to process that kind of information quickly and effectively, it sets us up for different capacities, different strengths in different areas. And so, yeah, there are a number of ways in which our basic senses are colored, flavored, if you will, by our maleness and femaleness, so that the basic way in which we interact with and perceive the world is coming through, in a sense, gendered glasses.
Yeah.
One way this some people argue that this manifests, which I think is profoundly interesting, is in newborns. So there was a study some years ago, Simon Baron Cohen, who's a researcher from Cambridge, and some other colleagues. They looked at newborns and they gave them options of different items to look at. They would hang items over the crib and they would measure how often they gazed at one item versus another. Mm-hmm. And what they found is that newborn girls would prefer to look at human faces, and newborn boys preferred to look at mechanical objects, which is really, really interesting if you think about it. And it again says something about kind of the strengths that that are already sort of starting to manifest, like these tendencies, these capacities that are ultimately complementary, but they do move us in somewhat different directions, and they're fascinating to reflect on.
Yeah, it makes me think of a friend of mine at the gym recently had a baby boy, and when it came time to introduce his baby boy to his siblings, the young boy came in and looked into the crib with the boy, and he's like, "Huh, All right, cool. Then just went outside and played basketball. And then the little girl came in to be introduced to the little baby and, whoo, scoops it up and then asks the mom, when does he become mine? It's like, well, technically never, but like just the response from the other side of
Yeah.
the crib as well. But in terms of like even
Yeah.
hearing and smell, I think of in my own life, I remember at one point I was holding one of our babies and sniffing the baby's head. And I'm like, why do I do this? Like I pick up a baby and I sniff his head. Like, why am I doing this? And so I get online and I start Googling, like, why am I smelling my baby's head? There's all this big body of literature comes up. Basically, what's going on there is that some olfactory nerves or whatever in your nose can sense whether it's pheromones or oils in the scalp of the baby, and the inhaling this actually triggers a part of the brain associated with drug addiction, where it's releasing dopamine and all this other stuff. And it's a bonding mechanism between the parent and the child. But they said, yeah, fathers can smell it. Women who've never had kids don't smell it that strongly. Women who have had kids can smell it in any kid. But the mother, it's intoxicating, the degree to which she can smell this. And it's a bonding mechanism between parent and child. And for the mom, it's particularly intense. And I think of the hearing, like my wife's hearing is completely different than my hearing. I mean, sometimes she'll wake up at night and she'll be like, honey, the baby's about to wake up. And then like in a minute later, the baby wakes up and starts crying. And I'm like, dude, like, how do you do that? Like you can hear him before he's crying and I can't even hear him once he is crying. I mean, like and I remember reading one study that said there's actually tones and inflections and nuances within the human voice that are entirely imperceptible to the male brain. It's like trying to listen to a radio without a radio. And like,
Right.
no, I don't hear radio waves. Whereas the wife's
Right.
got that antenna and she can pick up these inflections and nuances, which, from a perspective of like evolutionary biology would be in the best interest of the woman to be able to perceive the authenticity of the other person's intentions. And like, is this person being honest with me? I remember reading about how mirroring cells, especially within the woman's body, if the man's like, for example, lying to her and he's tense about it, and he has tension in his body because he knows he's being deceitful to her, her body will perceive the tension in him through this subconscious empathy in a sense, and she will begin to feel the tension in her own body, which begins to send her kind of alert system on high. Okay, something's off here, where her body is intuiting the tension within his, and it's just fascinating stuff. And so just kind of erase it all and be like, oh, it's just a social construct. It just argues against our bodies, which is a revelation of the person. Now,
Absolutely.
fascinating stuff. But, in terms of the topic today of gender, in particular, gender dysphoria, I had read that years ago, it was really predominantly boys that were diagnosed with gender dysphoria. It was like some 5-year-old boy who likes dressing up in his sister's outfits and playing with dolls. And then within the last decade and a half, this is flipped by a wide margin, where young girls are far more likely to diagnose and be diagnosed themselves with gender dysphoria. Why do you think it is that girls today, disproportionately far more than boys, are experiencing gender dysphoria?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one that I don't think we have all the answers to. So we can make some educated guesses, but the science is still very new on all of this. First of all, the phenomenon is robust that you described. That there's been this profound shift. The traditional model is, as you said, that there's a heavy predominance of boys, what we used to call gender identity disorder. It was much more common in boys than in girls, and would typically manifest in the grade school years. And one of the reasons that we would catch it then is because most kids, by the time they reach kindergarten, know that they're a boy or a girl, and they've achieved enough cognitive development to know that that's a stable characteristic that doesn't change, even if they, say, put on a dress or were to grow their hair out or something like that. But you have a very small subset that struggle with that and will express a desire to be the opposite sex or a belief that they are the opposite sex. And traditionally, those were more commonly boys. And so they would often be referred to clinics for treatment. The research on that, by the way, has shown that the vast majority of those cases, with or without treatment, will resolve before adulthood, meaning that the child will no longer identify with the opposite sex. That's a strong finding in the literature. Even the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the DSM, or of the American Psychiatric Association, our diagnostic manual in the field, stands by that and reports those statistics that the vast majority of cases will remit before adulthood. Now, there's always been another sort of subset of cases that used to be called late onset, and these are cases that would manifest at puberty or beyond. And those were cases that I think were fewer. What we're seeing now in the last 10 years or so is a huge increase in cases in adolescence and young adulthood, and predominantly with girls, such that the sex ratio is completely flipped in those cases. And it's led to a lot of speculation as to why is that going on? What is going on with these adolescent girls? I think to begin to unpack that, it's helpful to reflect on what I believe are the three major developmental tasks of adolescence that we all struggle with. And to put it very simply, I would summarize it this way: identity, community, and mission. So in other words, who am I? Where do I belong? And what's my purpose? Right, these are things that become extremely psychologically salient during this period of life. It becomes very, very important to us, okay, through the teen years into young adulthood. And we're trying to answer those questions. We're trying to get those needs met. Who am I? Where do I belong? What's my purpose? And I think culturally, historically, girls and women are in a tough spot because, we've had decades of feminism. We've had modernism turning into postmodernism, deconstructionism, all of this. We've had abortion and contraception for decades now. And we've got pornography all over the place. And so where does that leave girls and women? Motherhood's devalued. They're treated like objects. They're portrayed terribly and abused. In the pornography industry and all of this, right? It's like, I think in a certain way they've suffered the most because of some of these cultural trends. What the research does suggest, the little bit that we have, is that these girls who are showing up in gender clinics in the teen years, they show no previous history of gender dysphoria. There's no evidence that they struggled with this in childhood or had any prior manifestations. It seems to happen all of a sudden, which is why Lisa Littman and others have coined the term rapid onset gender dysphoria to try to capture this phenomenon. And it is regarded as a new phenomenon that is historically unprecedented. And as I was saying, the little bit of research that we have that looks at these girls and tries to answer this question, what is going on here, has shown us that these girls, by and large, have a long history of emotional and social problems. These are girls who, more than others, struggled to fit in, struggled emotionally, often having problems with depression and anxiety, sometimes eating disorders or other types of psychological problems, issues with self-esteem, sometimes self-injury, and even in a couple different studies now, we see higher rates of autism spectrum problems. So we're looking at a subset of girls. I think girls are at risk in general because of all the cultural stuff I talked about, but now we're looking at a subset of girls that are particularly vulnerable because they've already struggled with mental health problems. They've already struggled perhaps to fit in socially and to sort of feel like they're part of the group, and to establish friendship and community. And it seems like those girls are the ones that are somehow most vulnerable for this rapid onset gender dysphoria.
Yeah, and I would imagine that social media, in particular Instagram, things like that, make it feel almost impossible to be a woman because every image
Yes.
you see is impossible to measure up to. And so
Yes.
every girl, I'm sure, is just gnawing with like, the anxiety of just like, I can't be that. I can't look like her. I don't look like her.
Yes.
It just makes
Yes.
you feel probably less womanly every time you fail to meet up to these overly rigid gender stereotypes of airbrushed
That's right.
supermodels, and it
That's
makes you
right.
feel just even detached from your sense in a self. And then
Yes.
while searching for your identity, then you hop on YouTube or Instagram, and there's all
That's right.
these influencers and personalities saying, hey, if you're
Yes.
looking for your identity, this is probably it. You don't feel like a
That's
lady?
right.
Well, it's probably because you're trans.
That's
And,
right.
they don't, I imagine, I always presume the goodness of anybody's intentions. I think the
Yes.
people that are creating these videos been through a lot in life, have really wrestled in a painful way with gender dysphoria long before it was more socially accepted like it is today. At least, I mean, it's moving in the direction of greater social acceptance, but they're battle worn from their own gender dysphoria, and they just want to make that battle easier for young people to go through. But in doing so, they're putting thoughts into these kids' heads that if the kid wasn't on social media and absorbing all this stuff 24/7, they may wrestle with it a bit, but a lot of times I think they'd work through it in a different way instead of questioning, well, wait a minute, maybe I am in a sense trapped in the wrong body. Maybe I should take puberty blockers. Maybe cross-sex hormone therapy is the answer for me. And so what you're proposing here is obviously very controversial in terms of, wait a minute, there being roots or causes or links. It's like, no, no, no. She's trans because she's trans. Okay,
That's right.
that's who she is. And all we're doing is creating a more acceptable environment for her to embrace this true gender identity that she's always had. Instead of just imposing on her this arbitrary sex assigned at birth, it's almost like this third rail. You can't even touch it, this idea that there might be psychological roots rooted in the
That's right.
dynamics of the family, whether it be trauma or insecure attachments. Maybe
Right.
speak to that it isn't
Sure.
transphobia to talk about. Maybe there's some trauma there. Maybe there's some attachment issues that were never fully met. Could you dive into that just a little bit?
Absolutely. Yeah. So several things there. First, yeah, we cannot deny the very real and very probable role of what we call social contagion in this phenomenon of rapid onset gender dysphoria, meaning that I hear about this from others, I see it online, I hear it from friends, and it's an attractive, in a certain way, solution to those three problems of adolescence: identity, community, and mission, right? Because it tells me if I feel this way, if I'm even asking these questions, that means that I am transgender. So that's who I am. And that tells me then where I belong, my community. It opens the doors of this community to me, and it gives me an issue now that I can carry the banner and advocate for. So now I have a mission, and that is psychologically really powerful. It's really powerful when someone finds something that answers all three of those, and it's difficult to dislodge that unless you're offering something even more attractive. And unfortunately, as you're indicating, that the current mentality is that if I start down that road of questioning my gender, that automatically gets interpreted to mean I am trans, that this communicates something fundamental about my identity. And in fact, people in my field, in the mental health field, are being encouraged not to ask questions about the origin of these feelings because that's considered insensitive. Right? It's as if we're doubting this person's gender identity, and even a grade school age child, some are arguing, has enough cognitive ability, they say, to know whether they're trans or not. And if so, they express these things. We ought not question it. We ought to just accept it, and then to help them start down this path of transitioning, which I think is absolutely detrimental, absolutely detrimental and unjust to these young people, because we as their adults as the adults in their lives, their parents, their educators, their concerned adults, are to protect them. That's our job, is to protect them and to guide them and lead them according to the truth of what it means to be a human person made in God's image. And so, also related to this is if you look at the stories of D sisters or detransitioners, so people who have struggled with this and come out of it, one of the common themes that you hear in their stories is that no one asked me. No one asked me about trauma in my past. No one asked me about childhood issues. No one really dug into my story of when did these feelings first come up for me and their origin. And there's great sorrow and sometimes justified anger that those questions were not asked. Because those experiences in our families growing up and in our peer groups have a powerful influence on us. So our sense of ourselves, I mean, we talked earlier, Jason, about how male and female manifest through our bodies. But as we grow psychologically, we form a sort of mental image of ourselves, what we call a self-image, right? I have to come to some sort of psychological representation of who I am. And that psychological representation or self-image should be based in reality, and hopefully, it's true and not overly distorted. Well, that sense of myself that I develop over time is influenced in many ways by things that we experience in our families, what we witness going on in our parents' marriage, how they treat us, how they treat our siblings, just the broader family system, family culture that we're born into, and our early attempts as well to get along with other boys or other girls and to fit in with those groups. It's through those early years and through the grade school years that we're forming a sense of what does it mean for me to be a boy? What does it mean for me to be a girl? And the kind of roles and advantages or disadvantages that go with each of those. And there are a lot of ways that this can kind of go sideways for a small subset of kids. It's actually a very complex process that, we're lucky that it works the way it works for most people, because it's intricate. But it's for some kids, it can go off the rails for a number of reasons. So let's say, for instance, mom and dad have a troubled marriage. And let's say that perhaps the mom begins to try to perhaps gratify some of her emotional needs through her relationship with her son. And so the son begins to perceive dad, this masculine role model, as sort of scary or perhaps even cruel or something like that. And that it's, and begins to resent him, to maybe disidentify with him, or on the contrary, you can have a girl who wants to or feels a need to protect mom from the male aggressor and begins to identify with the aggressor. So these are just a couple examples of a myriad of ways in which little dynamics that can be very subtle can start to nudge a child in one direction or another to not form a self-image that is typical of a boy or a girl. And then you add all the complications with relationships with peers in there in the grade school years as well. I mean, if you have a boy, for instance, who perhaps isn't very interested or good at sports, or has some atypical interests, he may have a harder time fitting in with the other boys, right? And may take refuge with the girls. And for some, that may create confusion about, well, what does that mean for who I am? Like maybe I'm not really a boy, right? Maybe I'm supposed to be a girl or something like this, right? And vice versa. So there's a lot of ways psychologically and socially, a lot of different factors that can play into this. And there is some good evidence coming out looking at adults with gender dysphoria and the looking at their attachment patterns, attachment histories, and looking at evidence for developmental trauma. And one particular study that came out fairly recently, just within the last couple of years, showed a very high degree among these adults with gender dysphoria of insecure attachment in their past, and a very high rate of experiencing developmental traumas, things like abuse, neglect, sexual abuse or physical abuse, or traumatic losses of different kinds, families breaking up, parent struggling with an addiction or going to jail, or different things like this can have a profound impact on a child. And I think that, when someone comes in struggling with something like gender dysphoria, my tendency is to see this as a symptom. It's sort of like this is the flavor of their distress, right? They're experiencing distress, and this is just how the particular flavor of it, the way it's manifesting for this person. And my job is to try to understand the meaning of that symptom. What is it trying to say? What is it, where is it coming from? What's the root of this? And not get too caught up in, the symptom itself. We have to look to the meaning of it. Okay. Jason, you're probably familiar with Walt Heyer. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Yes. Wonderful Christian man. And he has a beautiful story. I mean, it's a painful story, but in the end, I think a beautiful one. And some of your listeners may be familiar with his story as well. But just very briefly, his story is, I think, interesting and instructive because he was one of these people who did suffer tremendously in childhood. He had some abuse experiences, and he had some confusing experiences with a grandmother who used to dress him up in a dress, and it was a secret thing. And he had some physical and sexual abuse experiences with males in his life growing up, and it was never dealt with and never discussed. And as an adult, he had this nagging sense that he was supposed to be a woman. He was supposed to be a woman, and he could not seem to shake it. And eventually, in midlife, he went through the whole sex change, sex reassignment process, chemicals, surgery, the whole thing, and it completely turned his life upside down. He lost his wife and family and a career. Lived for, I think it was about 8 years, more or less, as a woman, and he was thankfully influenced by some good Christian people in his life, but also I've heard him speak about, there was a psychiatrist that he met. He was working actually in the mental health field, a psychiatrist who suggested that he might have some unresolved trauma, what we call a dissociative disorder related to past trauma. And he got into some therapy focused on resolving past trauma. And that, along with other influences, good Christian influences in his life, he just got to a point where I don't want to be a woman anymore. Mm-hmm. And he, for the rest of his life, reclaimed his masculine identity and has lived as a man. And that story is not undifferent from what we see among a lot of desisters and detransitioners, people who have been through this and come back from it. It's there's sort of some sort of awakening that I don't really want to do this, and that often comes hand in hand with recognizing that there are other factors at play that contributed to these feelings, and those never got addressed. And once they start to get acknowledged and start to get addressed, this feeling of being the opposite sex or needing to be like the opposite sex starts to lessen. Yeah. And so I think that we have a duty to ask those kinds of questions, even if it's kind of falling out of favor, so to speak.
Yeah. Now, if you're a parent who's listening to this, perhaps or watching right now, and let's say two scenarios. One, you've got a 5-year-old son who feels like he's a girl and he gravitates towards the girl stuff and this, and he's, maybe going to a school where they foster this kind of idea of, okay, well, we can use different pronouns for you and this and that. And he's coming home a little bit confused. What do you do there? And also, let's say you've got a 15-year-old daughter and, she's been going through changes, but hey, it's a new school she's at and it's just adolescents. They go through changes. But, maybe she gets a shorter haircut and then hanging out with a new set of friends. And then before you know it, she's approaching you, Mom, Dad, I'm trans. I want to have a top surgery. This is who I am. Will you accept me or not? What's a parent to do in those two situations? 5-year-old boy starting to identify as a girl, 15-year-old girl who doesn't feel like she's identifying as a female anymore, and you're the parent. You don't want to obviously lose custody of your kid. You hear people saying, well, if you're forcing your kid into conversion therapy, that's just going to make them commit suicide because you're going to give them these electrical shock treatments and give your boy a truck and make him be a man. And obviously there's some probably really wrong forms of conversion therapy, but what's the healthy route look like?
Right,
what's a parent to do who obviously cares deeply for this child more than anybody on earth, wants to accept them and love them, but at the same respect knows that I can't just run along with this because it's not in the best interest of my child long term. What's mom and dad to do?
Yeah, these are really challenging scenarios, and obviously it's not a one size fits all sort of thing. So I'll give a few ideas and a few principles. So for the younger scenario that you talked about, the young boy, this was, as I mentioned before, the more common presentation for many years in gender clinics, and most of these cases, with or without therapeutic help, tend to resolve before adulthood. That was the case before today. Now, because of the cultural shift that's happened and the encouragement of transitioning, that may not be the case anymore. So the first thing I would want to do is to shield as much as possible this child from gender ideology, from influences that might encourage him to embrace this identity. So I would want to be very thoughtful and selective about media, about education, about peer group, things like that, and try to eliminate as much as possible influences that might encourage him down this path. With boys in that age group, the research suggests that there are several things that can help. One is bolstering the attachment security of the boy, especially with his father or father figures, right? So helping him, providing lots of ample time for father-son bonding, playtime together, finding things that they enjoy doing together, mutual interests that where they can have a good time together, and just spending lots and lots of time together. That seems really vitally important. In some cases, this means a restructuring of family life to a certain degree, or a shifting of who carries which responsibilities. Sometimes mom needs to learn to sort of step back a little bit more and make space for father and son to come together. Sometimes it can be a challenge too of maybe dad's not around. That can be a challenge that needs to be addressed in some way to give this boy an opportunity to form an attachment with a father figure. Also, there can be the challenge of we're very different. I like rough and tumble things and he doesn't, right? And so it's a matter of thinking outside the box to find some things that you enjoy together, even if they're not stereotypically boy things. Like the actual activity doesn't really matter as much as the quality time and the connection matters, because it's through the connection that the boy begins to identify with the father and say, hey, we enjoy this together. We're similar in this way. I guess I'm more like you than I realized. Mm-hmm. Okay. So that's important. And also fostering male friendships is key. So there was one study that is instructive in this regard. It's from the early 2000s, and it's a small study. Clinical studies tend to be small because it depends on people showing up in your practice with a particular kind of problem. And so this was a small clinical study of 11 cases of boys just like this that we're talking about at a particular clinic. And they ran them all through the same sort of treatment approach, the same treatment protocol. And it was very heavily focused on building up peer relationships. There were other aspects to it besides this, but this was one of the main foci of the study, was building up male peer relationships. So the parents were coached to identify other male peers that could be good playmates or friends for the child, and oftentimes these were boys that the child already had some relationship with, but they wanted to strengthen, and arranging play dates, lots of play dates, sometimes 5 a week kind of thing. So there's lots and lots of time having fun. They need to be positive, enjoyable experiences with other boys. And this particular treatment protocol, at least in this small study, was highly effective. And again, that was one piece among several, but it was one of the central pieces. And of the 11 cases in this study, 10 of the 11 resolved successfully in 6 months, which is tremendous outcome. So those are some of the things I would focus on with a young boy. Oh, and I should add one more thing, and that is, if the boy is engaged in some cross-gender types of things, he likes more stereotypically girl things, some of it you just sort of tolerate, and you don't make a big deal out of it. I've never come across anything that would encourage punishing that type of behavior. You just basically don't pay a whole lot of attention to it. If it's minor stuff, you tolerate it. If it's something that maybe is a little more problematic, like he wants to put on his sister's clothes or something like that, you gently redirect. You find something else for him to do that's interesting and enjoyable. So you kind of gently redirect. You don't punish, and basically just put more emphasis on the father-son bonding and the male-peer bonding.
Yeah, and as you mentioned this, I think of my boys. I mean, I've got 6 boys. And for some of them, they want to go shooting with dad, so we'll go out in the desert and we'll get big can of Cheese Whiz and shoot it with a Benelli M4 shotgun. And they're like, ah! And then, but then I've got a boy who's got more sensory integration issues, and he hates the loud noises.
Yeah.
And if I were to just be like, well, stay home, this is what the guys do, he would feel isolated in a sense from masculinity.
Right.
But it's like, okay, you can stay home. I mean, we get you the earphones if you want, we all wear those, but let's go golfing. Let's go do something else. There's so many other ways for male bonding except for the thumping on the chest and grunting that you can identify with manliness in a billion different ways, instead of being shoved into some little box. And if you don't fit in it, you're less of a man. And I think it's the dad's job or a male figure to show him masculinity has so many different expressions. But in the end, you're a man because you have the body of a man, and that reveals
That's
that.
right.
Now, how about the girl, though? You got a 15-year-old girl, and
Yes.
she's coming out to her parents as trans. They have no idea what to do, and she's talking about non-binary this and gender non-conforming this and queer that, and they're like, what the heck does any of this mean? What's mom and dad to do there?
Yeah. This is the more difficult case, and it's sadly more common today. So, some key principles first is pray, and recognize that your daughter belongs to the Lord, and that however this crisis resolves, He still has a plan for her life. And we have to start there because it's easy to panic, to fall into despair, to kind of go off the rails in a number of different ways. So we have to just start from that foundation that God has a plan for your child's life, and no matter how this resolves, He's not going to abandon her. I think it's also important for parents in situations like that to get lots of support for themselves, because it is a very challenging scenario. And there's a number of places that I would encourage them to look to get support for themselves. So one might be their pastor, to reach out to their pastor for spiritual help and support. There are support groups Now, you have to be careful where you go and where you look for these kinds of things, right? Because most of what's out there is going to, be steeped in some kind of gender ideology and in favor of transitioning. But there are support groups that are not that way, and there are organizations out there to help people connect with other parents who are in this situation who do not support transitioning. One organization that comes to mind is I believe it's called the Carinal Support Network. There are websites like Transgender Trend, Partners for Ethical Care. There's a whole bunch of them now that are cropping up, and these are largely grassroots organizations, oftentimes founded by parents who went through this and they needed help and they couldn't find it, so now they're trying to provide it to others. Okay. So also another good place to look for help is the End Courage apostolate. I know you're very familiar with Courage, Jason. The Courage apostolate provides support groups for men and women with same-sex attraction who want to live a chaste lifestyle. And the End Courage branch of that ministry provides support groups for loved ones of such people. But increasingly, End Courage groups are also attracting parents in this kind of scenario, a parent of an adolescent or a young adult with gender dysphoria. And Courage can be a nice place for them to land, to find other parents who are struggling to navigate these troubled waters and to remain true to their faith, to love their child, but not to enable or give in to things that ultimately are harmful. So those are some key places to look. Also, potentially someone like me, a therapist who shares your values. Again, we can be a little bit hard to find. CatholicTherapists.com is a good place to look. The Catholic Psychotherapy Association is another good place to look. Asking your pastor or your diocese, the family life office of your diocese, for a referral are also other good options. So you need plenty of support for yourself. With the daughter herself, one of the key things I think, there's so many challenges here, Jason. It's going to be hard to address them all, so I can't possibly do that. But a couple key things. One is to not overreact and try to just sort of make space for this is what my daughter, this is part of my daughter's experience right now. This is something that she's an idea or a feeling that she's struggling with. So let's explore that. Let's just be curious about it. Let's not be condemning. Let's not overreact, nor should we do backflips and celebrate this. Let's just be curious about this. Oh, I wonder how long you've been feeling this way, or I wonder when it first occurred to you, this idea first occurred to you. I wonder how you heard about this. I wonder, and just ask lots of questions. And you notice me using this phrase, I wonder. Yeah. I don't think I could do therapy without the phrase, I wonder. I use it all the time. And I often coach parents in using this phrase as well, because it conveys an interest and curiosity in the other that tends to help their defenses go down. Mm-hmm. So when I say that, I wonder, ... it tends to invite the other person to open up more, mm-hmm. right? As to opposed to say, why do you feel this way? Okay. Right? When you ask it that way, people are immediately on the defensive. It sounds like you're being interrogated. It sounds like there's some right or wrong answer, here that I'm being, set up for. So that open-ended, I wonder kind of curiosity, and just begin a conversation that's going to take more than one sitting. It's going to be something that kind of evolves over time. I would also encourage parents to think very seriously about the different influences in their daughter's life that may be contributing to this, whether that's social media, whether that's peer group, whether that's the school she's attending, whatever it might be. In some cases, parents have had to take drastic action and withdraw from certain schools, or even move the family altogether to get a fresh start. the social environment really matters. And Abigail Schreier in her book Irreversible Damage, she talks about this near the end. She gives some recommendations for parents in this situation, and she tells a story of one family that literally picked up and moved to a different part of the country to live in a community that shared their values more. And the daughter's struggles with gender dysphoria seem to sort of fade and subside altogether. So that's not like I said, it's not a one size fits all sort of thing, but we need to really think about the social environment and how can I shape that or eliminate certain influences that are doing harm right now. If you choose any kind of mental health care or medical care, you have to choose very, very carefully, very carefully, because the unfortunate reality is the standard of care that is being put forth in my profession and in the medical profession is transitioning. It's based on what's called the Dutch protocol, and there's 4 steps: social transition, puberty suppression, cross-sex hormones, and surgery. And that's what's being put forward. And so there's a high chance if you take a daughter like this to your average secular therapist, or especially if you go to a gender clinic at a children's hospital, something like that, they're going to be pushed in that direction. And in some cases, with or without your consent. And so you have to choose your professionals very carefully. I mentioned a few sources already to look for them. Look for good professionals who are going to support your Catholic or Christian values. Some other places to look are the Catholic Medical Association, the Christian Medical and Dental Association, places like that to find professionals who are going to align with your values more. Those are a few basic sort of initial thoughts, Jason. There's a lot more that could be said, and a lot of it's going to depend on case-by-case basis. There are a lot more resources out there now for parents in that situation than there were even just a couple years ago. And so I would strongly encourage any listeners or viewers in that situation to avail yourselves to them. I can send you some links, Jason, if you want to make available to your audience, because they don't have to suffer through this alone. That's one of the other traps, is that there's so much shame and embarrassment, is that we just try to resolve it ourselves, but you really can't. You need a lot of support, and you need to listen to other people who have been down this road.
Yeah, well, all the links that you send over, I'm more than happy to place in the show notes here, so the listeners, can tune in and check out those. Before we close up, one last question. Before it gets to that point, where your 15-year-old is saying, "Mom, I want top surgery," or this or that, what can parents do as their children develop to build in them a healthy sense of gender identity?
Yes, great question, and I love ending with a positive. So there's lots of things. The first thing I would say is we as adults, as parents, we need to work on our own appropriation of our maleness and our femaleness, right? And to live that well and joyfully, that my maleness is a gift to me, and my vocation to be a father is a gift. It's a joyful calling. It's a privilege, and to be able to live that joyfully well. I also cannot underscore enough the value of a strong marriage. A joyful, strong Christian marriage is a powerful thing, and can in a sense be a sort of a buffer or a protection for kids from a lot of things. And so we work on ourselves, we work on our marriages, we live our vocation well. That goes a long way. We work on our relationships with our kids. Like you gave a great example of, your one boy who doesn't like the loud noises. He's got some sensory integration stuff. So you find other ways to bond, other things to do together. And every time you do that and build up that relationship, it's like you're putting money in the bank. You're protecting him from so many different pitfalls that could happen along the way just by spending that time. and giving yourself in those different those opportunities.
Yeah, well, speaking of money in the bank, our kids just got out of school yesterday for their last day of school, so it's winter break, and I want to go put some money in the bank and hang out with them. Can you please tell listeners before we go how people can get in touch with the good work that you guys are doing at Ruah Woods, and any of the resources like the book Sexuality and Identity, Sexual
Sure.
Identity that you guys are coming out with, I believe, through
Yeah,
M.T.S. Please tell the
that's
listeners where
right.
they can get more information.
Yeah, absolutely. So the book Sexual Identity, it's coming out from Emmaus Road Publishing. It should be available in March. There should be a pre-order page going up about that very, very soon. And it's a multidisciplinary work with contributions from my field, from medicine, theology, philosophy. Great stuff. Ruah Woods, the organization I work for, we have a K through 12 theology of the body curriculum that is available through ruahwoodspress.com. That's RUAH woodspress.com. It's a beautiful curriculum that can help prevent a lot of these problems. And my particular corner of the ministry, Ruah Woods Psychological Services, is rwpsych.org.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Andrew, I can't thank you enough for coming on the program. And before we leave, I also want to make a shout out to Exodus. They're one of the sponsors of our program, and they also have an awesome Advent program I want you guys to tune into. If you just go to exodus90.com/Jason. There's 8-9 days left before Christmas, whatever it is. Check out their Advent preparation program that they've got there. I click on the app at night before I go to bed, hit day number 17, day 18, read the meditation, join that fellowship of people doing that. It's a beautiful way to prepare for the coming of Christ here in Advent. So it's not too late. You still got time. Go over to exodus90.com/Jason. Check out their Advent preparation program. It's definitely worth it. You're going to get as much as you can out of this Christmas by preparing well through that prayer app. So, Dr. Andrew, thank you again for coming on the program today. Keep up the wonderful work. God bless you for your courage and your love to be able to speak out on this issue.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you for the work you do as well.
Thank you.